The old man winced as rough hands yanked him out of his car. His body, frail with age, crumpled slightly under the force, but he didn't resist. There was no point. "Put your hands on the hood," one of the officers barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. The man, dressed in a clean gray suit with a neatly pressed tie, did as he was told. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer injustice of it all. "What's a man like you driving a car like this?" the second officer sneered, his hand resting on his holstered gun. The old man glanced at his car, a sleek black Mercedes, polished to perfection. It was his son's, a gift for his 72nd birthday. "I asked you a question," the officer pressed, shoving the man forward so his chest was flat against the hood. The old man began, but he was cut off by the sudden snap of cold metal locking around his wrists. "You think you can just ride around here like you own the place?" The first officer tightened the handcuffs. "We got a report of a stolen car matching this description." "It's not stolen," the old man said calmly. "It belongs to my son." "Your son?" The officer scoffed. "What, he a drug dealer?" The old man exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He could already feel the bruises forming on his wrists from how tight the cuffs were. "Search the car," the first officer ordered. The second one nodded and yanked open the driver's side door, tearing through the glove compartment, checking under the seats, pulling open every compartment. Nothing. The old man stayed silent, waiting. He had been in this position before, far too many times. It never got easier, but he had learned long ago that the more he spoke, the worse it got. "Tell us your name," the officer demanded. He sighed. "James Holloway." The officers shared a glance, but it was brief. The name meant nothing to them, but it should have, because the man they had just slammed against his own car was the father of the most feared judge in the entire city. And when his son found out about this, there would be hell to pay. James Holloway had been having a good morning, at least until now. He had woken up early, as he always did, made himself a cup of coffee, and stepped out onto his porch to breathe in the cool morning air. At 72, he enjoyed the little things. The sound of birds singing, the way the sun cast golden streaks across the sky, the familiar creak of his wooden rocking chair. He had worked hard his whole life to be able to enjoy moments like this. He had been a schoolteacher for 40 years, guiding young minds, teaching them about the world, about respect, about kindness. And yet, none of that mattered when it came to situations like this. James had needed to run a simple errand that morning, a trip to the bank to deposit a check. He had thought about taking the bus, but his son, Anthony, always insisted that he drive the Mercedes instead. "Dad, it's safer," he had said, "and more comfortable." James had chuckled at that. He didn't need a luxury car to feel comfortable. He had grown up in a small town with little money, where comfort was simply having food on the table and a roof over your head. But Anthony was different. His son had worked his way up, built a career so powerful that people trembled at the mere mention of his name. Judge Anthony Holloway. James had never been one to brag, but he couldn't help feeling proud of the man his son had become. Fair, just, unshakable. And yet, here he was now, pinned against his own car, treated like a criminal. The first officer turned back to him. "What were you doing driving this car?" "I was on my way to the bank," James replied, his voice even. The second officer smirked. "Uh-huh. And what's in your pockets?" James knew better than to move suddenly. "My wallet and a check I was going to deposit." The officer dug into his pockets roughly, pulling out his wallet and check. He flipped it open, glancing at James' ID. "James Holloway," he read aloud. Then, after a pause, "This address is in one of the wealthier parts of town." James didn't answer. "You expect me to believe you live there?" James sighed again. "Believe what you want." The officer chuckled. "Smart guy, huh?" The second officer walked over. "Car's clean. No drugs, no weapons." The first officer clicked his tongue, disappointed. "Doesn't mean he didn't steal it." James shook his head. "I told you. It's my son's car." The officers laughed. "Oh yeah? And who's your son?" "Some big-shot businessman." James didn't answer. That was a mistake. The first officer grabbed him by the arm. "You think this is funny?" James winced as the grip tightened. "Maybe we should take him in," the second officer suggested. "Hold him until we can confirm the car's not stolen." James could feel it then, the familiar weight of exhaustion. This wasn't the first time this had happened to him, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. People saw a black man in a nice car, and they assumed the worst. It didn't matter that he was old. It didn't matter that he was respectable. All that mattered was that he didn't look like he belonged. James kept his voice steady. You can check the registration in the glove compartment. The officer glanced at the car, then at James. He didn't move, because he didn't want proof. He wanted power. James could see it in his eyes. The hunger, the satisfaction of having control over someone else, of making them feel small. The second officer was about to say something when his radio crackled. A voice came through, sharp and urgent. Dispatch to all units. We need immediate assistance at. The officer lifted his radio to respond, but James saw the hesitation in his face. For a moment, just a moment, he thought they might let him go. But then the first officer tightened his grip. Take him in, he said. James' heart sank. The second officer nodded. And just like that, the cuffs tightened, and they started leading him toward the squad car. His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't fight back. He didn't need to. Because the moment his son found out about this, the officers would regret everything. Every shove, every smirk, every moment of disrespect. They had no idea, but they would soon. And when they did, they would wish they had never laid eyes on James Holloway. James Holloway sat in the back of the squad car, his hands still cuffed behind him, his wrists sore from the unnecessary tightness. The officers had barely spoken since shoving him inside, their moods shifting into something unreadable. The city moved around them as they drove, people walking, cars honking, life continuing as usual. No one knew, no one cared that an innocent man was being taken to the station for no reason other than existing in the wrong place, in the wrong car, with the wrong skin color. James let out a slow breath and closed his eyes. He had learned long ago that anger wouldn't solve anything. But what he couldn't stop thinking about was his son, Anthony. The moment Anthony found out, things would change. The officers had no idea that they had just arrested the one man they shouldn't have touched. They had no idea that his son was the most feared judge in the city. And by the time they realized it, it would be too late. It had all started as a normal day. James had been planning to meet up with an old friend for lunch after stopping at the bank. He had driven through the neighborhood carefully, following every traffic rule. He had stopped at a red light when he noticed a police car pull up next to him. He glanced over casually and saw the officer in the driver's seat staring at him. Not just looking, staring. James had been through enough in life to recognize that kind of look. It was the look of someone already making assumptions. A black man, in a luxury car, alone. James turned his eyes back to the road and waited for the light to change. He was careful not to reach for anything, not to move too suddenly, not to do anything that could be misinterpreted. The light turned green. He drove forward, steady and slow, but within seconds, the police car pulled behind him. Flashing lights. A siren. James sighed and pulled over. He rested his hands on the wheel, already knowing how this would go. The officer took his time approaching, and when he finally reached the driver's side, James kept his hands where they could be seen. License and registration. James nodded, moving slowly. It's in the glove compartment. Move slow, the officer said, hand resting on his holstered gun. James opened the glove compartment and pulled out the documents. He handed them over. The officer looked at them for only a second before glancing back at the car. This yours? James considered the answer. Saying no might lead to more questions. Saying yes might make them think he had stolen it. It belongs to my son. The officer's eyes narrowed. Your son, huh? Yes. The officer studied him, then the car. What's your son's name? James took a breath. Anthony. He didn't add the last name. Not yet. The officer hummed. Where are you heading? The bank. The officer nodded, looking over the documents again. Then he turned to his partner. Step out of the car. James had wanted to argue. He had wanted to tell them that he had done nothing wrong. But he already knew that wouldn't work. And so he stepped out. And now here he was, in the back of a police car. Handcuffed. For what? For driving? For existing? For daring to sit behind the wheel of a car they thought he wasn't supposed to have? James didn't speak as the car pulled into the police station parking lot. The officers stepped out, one of them opening the back door and gripping James' arm roughly as they pulled him out. James winced, but said nothing. He was led inside, past other officers who barely glanced his way. This wasn't unusual to them. No one asked if he was okay. No one asked if he needed anything. They just processed him like they had done it 100 times before. James swallowed hard as they led him to a holding cell, uncuffed him, and shut the door. The lock clicked into place. James sat down slowly on the hard bench. He glanced at the other men in the cell, two younger black men, both looking tired, both looking like they already knew the routine. One of them, a young man in his 20s, looked over. "What they get you for?" James sighed. "Driving my car." The young man let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, that'll do it." James leaned back against the cold wall. He didn't belong here. He wasn't a criminal. And when his son found out, neither of these officers would have a badge by the end of the week. He was sure of it. Meanwhile, across town, Anthony Holloway sat in his office, reviewing a case file. His desk was piled high with papers, his coffee long gone cold. His assistant, Lisa, knocked on the door before stepping inside. "Judge Holloway." He didn't look up. "What is it?" "There's a call for you." "I'm busy," he said, flipping through a document. Lisa hesitated. "Sir, it's the police station." Anthony finally looked up. His eyes narrowed. "The station?" Lisa nodded. "It's about your father." Anthony froze. A strange, slow anger curled inside him. "My father." His voice was deadly calm. Lisa nodded again. Anthony set the file down carefully and stood. "Put them through." Lisa rushed to transfer the call, and Anthony picked up the phone. "This is Judge Holloway," he said. There was silence on the other end for a beat. Then, a nervous voice. Sir, we have James Holloway in custody." Anthony's grip on the phone tightened. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "What?" he said, voice low. "Did you just say?" The officer on the other end cleared his throat. We brought in a James Holloway. We just needed to confirm." Click. Anthony hung up. His entire body was thrumming with rage. He grabbed his coat, his keys, his phone. Lisa watched him with wide eyes. "Sir, where are you going?" "To the station," he said. Lisa swallowed. Should I call someone?" "No." Anthony's voice was calm. "Deadly. I'll handle this myself." And as he stormed out of his office, there was only one thought on his mind. Someone was about to lose their job. Maybe more than just their job. And they had no idea what was coming for them. Inside the cold, dimly lit holding cell, James Holloway sat still, his expression calm despite the storm brewing inside him. He had spent his entire life teaching young men like the one sitting next to him how to navigate a world that often refused to see their humanity. And yet, here he was, just another statistic, just another old man in a cage for no reason. The young man who had spoken earlier, the one who had asked what he'd been brought in for, shook his head. "You don't look like you belong here, man." James gave him a small smile. "Neither do you." The young man chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Maybe. But they got a way of making sure we end up here anyway, don't they?" James had no answer for that. Outside the cell, officers moved through the station, carrying on with their duties. The two who had arrested James were at the front desk. Filling out paperwork like this was just another day at work. But that was about to change. Because at that very moment, Judge Anthony Holloway was on his way. And he was furious. The ride to the police station was silent, but inside Anthony's head, thoughts raced at lightning speed. His father, his 72-year-old father, was sitting in a holding cell for no reason. The moment Lisa had told him the police station was calling about his father, he had already known. He had seen it happen too many times. A black man, a nice car, a cop with a badge and a power complex. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. These officers had no idea what they had just done. They had no idea who they had put behind bars. And they had no idea who they had just angered. Anthony didn't care about being feared. He didn't care about his reputation. But there was one thing he cared about. Justice. And tonight, justice would be served. Inside the station, the two officers, Officer Reynolds and Officer Tanner, were finishing up the report on James Holloway's arrest when the front doors of the station burst open. The entire room seemed to shift. Anthony Holloway walked in, his long coat billowing behind him, his face set in an expression that sent a chill through the room. The officers at the front desk looked up, startled. One of them, the desk sergeant, sat up straighter. The two arresting officers, however, had no idea who he was. "Can we help you?" Reynolds asked lazily, barely looking up. Anthony didn't speak right away. Instead, he pulled out his badge, the one that identified him as the sitting judge of the state's highest criminal court, and placed it on the counter. Then, in a voice as calm as it was deadly, he said, "Where is my father?" Reynolds blinked. "You're your father?" Officer Tanner frowned. Who's your father?" Anthony's dark eyes locked onto them, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the officers' faces. "James Holloway," Anthony said slowly, enunciating every syllable. Where is he? Reynolds and Tanner exchanged a glance, confusion turning to alarm. They looked back down at the paperwork they had just finished filling out. James Holloway. The same James Holloway who had been sitting quietly in the holding cell. The same man they had shoved against his own car. The same man they had handcuffed and humiliated. Oh no, Tanner muttered under his breath. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Anthony leaned in slightly, his presence heavy, his tone never rising, never yelling. But somehow, that made it worse. Take me to him. Now. No one moved at first. Then the desk sergeant stood up quickly. Right this way, sir. He practically sprinted toward the hallway leading to the cells, and Anthony followed, his steps sharp and controlled. Reynolds and Tanner remained frozen, their stomachs dropping, realizing, for the first time, exactly how bad they had messed up. Because Judge Anthony Holloway wasn't just any judge. He was the judge, and he was here to collect his father. James Holloway heard the sound of footsteps before he saw his son. And then, suddenly, there he was. Anthony stood outside the holding cell, his face unreadable, his eyes burning with quiet fury. James had seen his son in many moods, proud, frustrated, even angry. But he had never seen him like this. Silent, controlled, dangerous. The officer who had led Anthony here scrambled for the keys, fumbling as he unlocked the cell door. Sir, we didn't know. Save it, Anthony said, his voice like ice. The door swung open, and Anthony stepped forward. James stood. Son. Anthony's jaw tightened. He reached out and placed a firm hand on his father's shoulder, his grip both steady and reassuring. Let's go, he said. James nodded, stepping past the officers as Anthony guided him out of the cell. The two younger men in the cell watched in awe. One of them let out a low whistle. Man, I don't know who you are, but I wish I had someone like that coming to get me. James paused for a brief moment, meeting the young man's gaze. Then, with a quiet but firm voice, he said, Everyone deserves someone like that. And with that, he walked out, his son by his side. The moment they stepped back into the main station, the entire room went dead silent. Officers stopped what they were doing. Some looked down at their desks. Others avoided eye contact. Reynolds and Tanner were still standing near the front, looking pale. Anthony didn't even glance at them. He just walked, his father beside him, moving toward the front doors. No one stopped them. No one dared. The doors swung open, and as Anthony helped his father into the car, he finally spoke. They're going to pay for this, he said, his voice low. James sighed as he settled into the passenger seat. Son. No, Anthony cut him off. They don't get to do this. Not to you. Not to anyone. James looked at him carefully. He knew his son. He knew the fire that burned inside him. The fire that made him the best judge in the state. But fire could burn. And right now, his son was burning. James placed a hand on Anthony's arm. Anger won't fix this. Anthony exhaled sharply. But justice will. James nodded slowly. And as Anthony started the car, driving away from the station, both men knew. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because what had happened tonight wasn't just a mistake. It was a warning. And Anthony Holloway was about to teach the entire police department exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong man. The ride home was silent. Anthony gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he stared at the road ahead. His mind was a storm. Rage, disbelief, and a thirst for justice all swirling together. His father sat beside him, his posture calm, his hands resting lightly on his lap. But Anthony knew better. He knew that beneath that calm, his father was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. And that made him angrier than anything. After a few minutes, James finally spoke. Son, you need to breathe. Anthony didn't answer. You're gripping the wheel so hard, I think you might snap it in two, James added with a hint of humor. Anthony let out a sharp breath, forcing himself to loosen his grip. But the anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface. They humiliated you, he said, his voice low but controlled. Treated you like a criminal. Like you were nothing. James nodded slowly. Yes. And you're just okay with that? James turned to look at his son. Of course not. Anthony glanced at him, confused. James sighed, settling back into the seat. Son, I've been black in America longer than you've been alive. Do you think this is the first time this has happened to me? Anthony's hands clenched again, his jaw tightening. It should have never happened. Not to you. Not to anyone. James studied his son's face. And what are you going to do about it? Anthony didn't hesitate. I'm going to make sure those officers never wear a badge again. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that won't change what they believe. Anthony scoffed. So? They should lose everything for what they did. James sighed. And then what? 2 more officers just like them take their place? You know the system. You know how deep this goes. Anthony pressed his lips together. So what? We just let them get away with it. No, James said firmly. But justice isn't about revenge, son. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to the next person. And the next. Anthony shook his head. They'll do it again. Not if we make sure they understand why they shouldn't. Anthony exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel again. His father was always the patient one, always believing in the possibility of change. But Anthony, he wasn't that forgiving. And the city was about to find out just how far he was willing to go. The next morning, Officer Reynolds and Officer Tanner walked into the station like it was any other day. They had barely slept, the realization of what they had done hitting them sometime around midnight. But they told themselves it was just another misunderstanding. They had made an honest mistake. Or so they thought. Because the moment they stepped inside, the entire station was buzzing. People were whispering. Eyes darted toward them, then away. Some officers were muttering under their breath. Others shook their heads. Reynolds frowned. What's going on? Tanner barely had time to shrug before their captain's office door swung open. Reynolds. Tanner. My office. Now. The 2 officers exchanged glances. This wasn't good. They walked in, the door slamming shut behind them. The captain, a stocky man with graying hair, was pacing, his expression dark. Do you 2 have any idea what kind of hellstorm you've just started? He snapped. Reynolds swallowed hard. Sir, we. The captain threw a file onto the desk. Judge Holloway. Tanner paled. Sir, we didn't know. No, you didn't. And that's the problem. The captain glared at them. Do you understand who this man is? Reynolds nodded slowly. We know now. Oh, you know now? That's real helpful. The captain scoffed. Because as of this morning, the DA is looking into formal misconduct charges against you both. The mayor is involved. And Judge Holloway? He's not letting this go. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. Tanner shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we thought the car was stolen. Did you check the registration? Silence. The captain slammed his hand on the desk. Did you even ask the man anything before you slammed him against his own car? Before you put him in cuffs? Before you dragged a 72-year-old man into a holding cell like some thug? Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. The captain sighed, shaking his head. I should suspend you both on the spot. Tanner stiffened. Sir. But I'm not, the captain continued. Because Judge Holloway requested something else. Reynolds and Tanner blinked. What? Tanner asked cautiously. The captain leaned forward. He wants you both in his courtroom. Today. Reynolds' stomach dropped. We're being charged? No, the captain's eyes darkened. But you're about to learn a very public lesson. An hour later, the courtroom was packed. News had already spread. Judge Holloway had called a special session. No case, no trial. Just a message. Reynolds and Tanner sat stiffly in the front, dressed in their uniforms, their badges suddenly feeling heavier than usual. And then, the doors opened. Anthony Holloway walked in, his robe flowing behind him, his expression unreadable. The room stood in silence as he took his seat at the bench. Then he spoke. Before we begin, let me make one thing clear. His voice was calm, measured, controlled. But beneath that control was fire. This is not a trial, he continued. I will not be pressing charges. Reynolds and Tanner almost exhaled in relief. Almost. But, Anthony said sharply, this is justice. He leaned forward slightly. What happened yesterday should not have happened. His eyes locked onto the officers. Not just because I am a judge. Not just because my father is a respected man. But because no one deserves to be treated the way you treated him. Tanner swallowed hard. Anthony continued, his voice never rising, yet carrying the weight of the room. My father has spent his life teaching. He has raised men who went on to be leaders, fathers, role models. He has given more to this city than either of you will ever understand. He let that sink in. And yet, in one moment, you stripped him of his dignity. You saw his skin, you saw his car, and you assumed the worst. Reynolds shifted in his seat. Anthony's expression didn't change. And that, he said, voice sharp, is the real crime. The room was silent. Then Anthony sat back. So, Here's what's going to happen. Reynolds and Tanner tensed. You will keep your badges. You will not be fired. Their relief was short-lived. But, Anthony said, for the next 6 months, you will be working in the community you have spent your careers policing. You will spend time in the neighborhoods you so easily judge. You will sit with the people you assume the worst about. He leaned forward again. And you will learn. Reynolds' throat felt dry. Sir, Silence, Anthony said, his voice like a knife. Then, for the first time, he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was a warning. You will understand why this was wrong, Anthony said. Or I will make sure you never wear that badge again. The gavel came down. The decision was final. And the lesson had only just begun. The courtroom remained silent long after Judge Anthony Holloway struck the gavel. Reynolds and Tanner sat frozen in their seats, their faces drained of color. It wasn't a trial. It wasn't a conviction. But it felt like a sentence. 6 months. 6 months of working in the very communities they had spent their careers avoiding, judging, and policing with suspicion. 6 months of confronting the people they had harassed, of looking them in the eye and realizing what they had done. And the worst part? It was mercy. Judge Holloway could have destroyed them. He could have made sure they never wore a badge again, that their names were ruined, their careers over. But instead, he had given them something far worse. A chance to understand. A chance to see the truth. A chance to change. And the weight of that was heavier than any punishment they could have imagined. The judge stood from his bench, his eyes never leaving them. This court is adjourned. The words echoed in the silent room. Then, slowly, people began to rise. Some murmured to themselves, others shook their heads. The reporters who had packed the courtroom scribbled furiously in their notepads, their cameras flashing as they captured the 2 disgraced officers sitting stiffly in their seats. James Holloway watched from the second row, his hands resting on his lap. He had said nothing during the entire session. He had simply watched. And now, as his son stepped down from the bench, their eyes met. James nodded. And Anthony exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally loosening. It was done. But it wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with the chatter of reporters, activists, and spectators who had gathered after hearing about the session. James and Anthony walked down the steps together, their pace steady, their faces unreadable. Judge Holloway. Judge Holloway. The reporters swarmed forward, their microphones extended. Why didn't you press charges? One asked. Do you think 6 months of community service is enough? Another pressed. Sir, what do you hope to accomplish by this decision? Anthony didn't stop walking. But James did. The reporters turned, surprised, as the old man, who had been silent all morning, finally spoke. I hope, James said, his voice calm yet firm, that they learn what it means to be human. The crowd hushed. James' eyes swept over them. We don't need revenge. We don't need to destroy them. What we need is for them to understand. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded. Some didn't. Anthony watched his father with quiet respect. Then James turned, facing his son. Let's go home. Anthony nodded. And without another word, they walked away. Reynolds sat stiffly at his desk, his hands clasped together. The entire station had been talking about the courtroom session all day. Some officers shook their heads, muttering about how Judge Holloway was making an example out of them. Others remained quiet, unsure of what to say. But Reynolds? He felt something he hadn't expected. Shame. He had arrested plenty of people before. Some innocent, some guilty. But it had always felt justified. But yesterday, there had been nothing justified about it. Just power. Just assumptions. And that old man, James Holloway, had looked at him like he knew. Like he had seen it before. Like he had expected it. That was what haunted Reynolds the most. Not that he had arrested the father of a judge, but that James had expected to be treated that way. And that felt worse than anything. A week later, Reynolds and Tanner sat in a community center, both dressed in plain clothes. Their 6-month assignment had officially begun. It wasn't a punishment, at least not on paper. It was an education. A crash course in what it meant to be human. Their first task? A youth mentorship program. All right, everyone. The program coordinator, a middle-aged black woman named Ms. Harass, clapped her hands. We've got 2 new volunteers joining us today. Let's make them feel welcome. Reynolds and Tanner stood awkwardly as a group of teenagers eyed them with suspicion. They knew. They all knew. One of the boys, probably no older than 16, crossed his arms. So what? You guys get in trouble, and now you're here to pretend like you care? Reynolds shifted. Tanner cleared his throat. We're here to learn. The boy scoffed. Yeah? Learn what? Silence. Reynolds exhaled. And then, for the first time, he said the truth out loud. We're here to learn how to be better. The boy studied him. The entire room was silent. Then Miss Harris smiled. Well, she said, you've come to the right place. And just like that, the lesson began. But this time, the officers were the students, and the community was the teacher. That night, James sat on his porch, the summer air warm, the sky dark with stars. Anthony sat beside him, sipping his drink. For the first time in days, there was peace. Do you think they'll change? Anthony asked after a while. James was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. I think, he said softly, they'll finally start to see. Anthony let out a breath, leaning back in his chair. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe it, too. James Holloway woke up early, as he always did. The world was quieter in the morning, the air crisp, the city not yet fully awake. He stepped onto his porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and watched the sun rise. It had been a week since his wrongful arrest. A week since his son had delivered justice in the way only a judge could. And yet, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing the officers. It was about something deeper. Understanding. True change didn't come from punishment alone. It came from growth. From realizing you were wrong and choosing to be better. The question was, would they? Reynolds and Tanner were learning fast that their 6-month assignment was not going to be easy. Every day, they were met with distrust. Every day, they walked into community centers, schools, and outreach programs where people knew what they had done. They weren't welcomed, and they weren't forgiven. Yet. All right, listen up, Miss Harris said, standing in front of a group of teenagers at the community center. We're talking about conflict resolution today. You know, how to handle situations without letting things get out of control. Reynolds and Tanner sat at the back, observing. Miss Harris turned to them suddenly. Officers, let me ask you something. When was the last time you de-escalated a situation instead of escalating it? Reynolds blinked. Well, not a traffic stop, she interrupted. Not an arrest. A real moment. When was the last time you looked at someone scared, someone frustrated, and chose to help instead of control? Tanner shifted uncomfortably. Neither of them had an answer. The teenagers in the room watched them, waiting. One of them, a 17-year-old named Malik, crossed his arms. You ever de-escalate something? Or is your first move always putting cuffs on people? Reynolds sighed. Then, finally, he spoke. I honestly don't know. The room fell silent. Miss Harris studied him. Well, she said after a moment, maybe that's why you're here. Reynolds swallowed. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Anthony Holloway sat at his desk, scanning a stack of legal documents. His name had been in the papers all week. Judge Holloway delivers unorthodox justice. Judge's father arrested in racial profiling incident. Officers assigned to community service. Holloway family sparks conversation on police reform. He had given no interviews. He had no interest in fame. All he wanted was for his father to be treated with the dignity he deserved. And if that meant making a few people uncomfortable, good. His phone buzzed. It was Lisa. Sir, your father is here. Anthony frowned. My father? Yes. He's in the lobby. Anthony sighed, already standing. I'll be right there. James sat calmly in the courthouse lobby, his hands resting on his cane. He had never been inside his son's chambers before. When Anthony walked in, his eyebrows raised. Dad, what are you doing here? James smiled. Thought I'd come see where you work. Anthony smirked. You never cared before. James chuckled. I still don't. But I do care about something else. Anthony sat down beside him. What's that? James looked at his son, his eyes steady. The two officers. Anthony's smirk faded. What about them? I want to talk to them. Anthony stared at his father. Talk. Dad, they humiliated you. They treated you like. James raised a hand, stopping him. I know. And you did what you had to do. But now, I need to do something. Anthony exhaled. Why? James leaned forward. Because if we really want change, son, we have to start with understanding. Anthony sighed, rubbing his temple. Then, finally, he nodded. I'll set it up. Reynolds wasn't sure why he felt nervous. It wasn't an official meeting. It wasn't a disciplinary hearing. But somehow, sitting in the small cafe, waiting for James Holloway to arrive, felt more terrifying than standing before Judge Holloway in court. When James finally walked in, he moved with the same quiet dignity he had carried the night of his arrest. Tanner sat up straighter. Reynolds swallowed. James sat down across from them. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. "Tell me," he said, folding his hands. "What did you see when you pulled me over?" Reynolds shifted. Tanner opened his mouth, then closed it. James tilted his head slightly. "Well," Reynolds exhaled. "We saw a black man in a nice car." James nodded. "And?" Tanner sighed. "And we assumed the worst." James studied them. "Why?" Neither of them had an answer. "Was it the way I was driving?" James continued. "Did I break any laws?" "No," Reynolds admitted. "Was I rude? Was I aggressive?" "No." James nodded again. "So tell me, gentlemen, why was I in cuffs?" The silence stretched. And then, for the first time, Reynolds said what he had been too ashamed to admit. "Because we weren't thinking about you as a person." James met his eyes. Reynolds swallowed. "We were thinking about statistics. About all the times we've pulled people over and found something. We stopped seeing individuals." James exhaled. Then, he did something neither of them expected. He smiled. "You know," James said, "I used to teach young boys who thought just like you." Tanner frowned. "Like us?" James nodded. "Boys who were raised to believe certain things. Who didn't even realize they were carrying those beliefs until someone challenged them." He leaned back. "That's why I wanted to meet with you." Reynolds and Tanner exchanged a glance. James continued. "Because the difference between a mistake and a pattern is whether or not you learn from it." Tanner exhaled. "You really think we can change?" James smiled again. "I think anyone can change. If they want to." Reynolds swallowed, nodding slowly. And for the first time in years, he wanted to. Anthony Holloway was waiting when his father stepped out of the cafe. "Well?" Anthony asked, crossing his arms. James smiled. "They'll be fine." Anthony scoffed. "You think so?" James nodded. "I know so." Anthony shook his head with a small smile. "You always did believe in people too much." James chuckled. "And you never believed in them enough." Anthony sighed, looking up at the sky. I don't trust that they'll change." James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Then let's wait and see." And for the first time, Anthony thought. Maybe his father was right. Maybe, just maybe, change was coming after all. Reynolds sat in his patrol car, parked outside the community center. It had been 2 months since Judge Holloway's ruling. 2 months of community service. 2 months of being forced to sit, listen, and, most of all, see. And for the first time in his career, he was starting to understand. He looked at Tanner, who was in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead. "You ever think about how many times we've done this?" Reynolds asked suddenly. Tanner glanced at him. "Done what?" Reynolds sighed. "Pulled people over. Assumed things about them. Never even considered we might be wrong." Tanner didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, "Yeah, I think about it every day now." The silence between them was heavy. The past few months had changed them, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Today was no different. Ms. Harris had asked them to assist with a new program, one focused on rebuilding trust between the police and the community. Reynolds wasn't sure if trust could be rebuilt, but maybe it could start. Inside the community center, James Holloway sat at the back of the room, observing. He hadn't been asked to come. He hadn't needed to be here. But something inside him wanted to see this for himself. Wanted to see if the 2 officers who had once treated him like a criminal had truly learned anything. Ms. Harris stood at the front, her arms crossed. "All right, listen up," she said. "Today's session is simple. We're going to talk about fear." A few of the teenagers in the room perked up. "Fear?" Malik, the outspoken 17-year-old, raised an eyebrow. "Fear of what?" Ms. Harris smiled. "Fear of each other." Reynolds stiffened. Tanner shifted in his seat. They knew where this was going. Ms. Harris gestured toward the officers. "Tell me, Officers Reynolds and Tanner, have you ever been afraid of a black man?" The room went silent. Reynolds felt his mouth go dry, but he didn't look away. "Yes," he admitted. Some of the teenagers scoffed. Others looked unsurprised. "Why?" Malik pressed. Reynolds sighed. "Because I was raised to be." A hush fell over the room. Even Tanner turned to stare at him. Reynolds continued, his voice steady but strained. "My whole life, I've been told to be careful. That certain neighborhoods were dangerous. That certain people were dangerous." He exhaled. "And I believed it." The teenagers listened. Reynolds swallowed. "And when you believe something long enough, you stop questioning it." Malik crossed his arms. And now? Reynolds looked him in the eye. Now, I know I was wrong. Malik's eyes narrowed. Reynolds continued. You asked me if I've ever been afraid of a black man. He nodded. Yes, but not because of anything you did. Because of what I was taught. The room remained silent. Then, after a moment, Malik nodded slowly. And that was the first step. James watched as the session continued. He saw the way Reynolds and Tanner listened, the way they answered questions, not defensively, not angrily, but honestly. And for the first time, he thought, maybe they were getting it. When the session ended, Reynolds made his way toward James. James didn't move. The officer stopped in front of him, shifting on his feet. Mr. Holloway. James raised an eyebrow. Officer. Reynolds hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he said, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. James studied him for a long moment. Reynolds cleared his throat. Not because of your son. Not because I got caught. But because I know what I did was wrong. James nodded slowly. Good. Reynolds swallowed. And he sighed. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know. I'll be better. James was quiet for a moment. Then, finally, he smiled. Then prove it. Reynolds nodded. And just like that, the second step was taken. That night, Anthony Holloway sat in his father's living room, sipping a cup of coffee. So, Anthony asked, did they grovel at your feet? James chuckled. No groveling. Just learning. Anthony smirked. They should have been fired. James shook his head. And what would that have changed? Anthony sighed. James set his cup down. You wanted revenge. I wanted justice. James smiled knowingly. And yet, look at them now. Anthony exhaled. James leaned back in his chair. You can't change people by punishing them. You change them by showing them why they need to be better. Anthony shook his head with a small smirk. You always were too patient. James chuckled. And you never were. Anthony took another sip of coffee, staring at his father. Then, after a long moment, he said, maybe this time, you were right. James smiled, because he already knew that. And for the first time since this all began, Anthony knew it, too. The weight of the past few months lingered in the air like the last traces of a storm, still present, but slowly fading. James Holloway had spent his entire life teaching, believing in people, hoping they would change. And now, for the first time in a long time, he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, some people could. But the world had a way of testing convictions. And tonight, that test was coming. Reynolds sat in his patrol car, parked just outside a gas station on the south side of town. He had driven past this street dozens of times before, but tonight, it felt different. Maybe it was because of everything he had learned these past few months. Or maybe it was because he was finally seeing things he had ignored for years. Tanner was in the passenger seat, flipping through his notebook. Hey, Reynolds said suddenly. Tanner looked up. Yeah. Reynolds stared out the window, watching a group of young men standing near the station, talking. What do you see? He asked. Tanner frowned. What? Reynolds nodded toward the group. If this was a month ago, what would you see? Tanner sighed, rubbing his jaw. A bunch of guys standing around at night. Maybe trouble. Reynolds nodded. Then he exhaled. But what if we're wrong? Tanner didn't answer. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. We always assume the worst, don't we? Tanner leaned back. Yeah, he admitted. They sat in silence for a moment. Then, a shout. Reynolds snapped his head up. Across the street, one of the young men had stumbled backward, his hands up. Another man, older, rougher, had a gun. Hey! Reynolds threw open his door, instincts kicking in. Tanner was right behind him. The situation escalated fast. The man with the gun was shouting, waving it wildly. The young men were backing away, hands raised. It was a moment, one moment, where everything could go wrong. Reynolds had been in situations like this before. And before, he wouldn't have hesitated. Before, he would have drawn his weapon. Before, he would have barked orders, taken control, escalated. But now he hesitated. Now, he thought about everything James Holloway had told him. Now he asked himself, was there another way? Reynolds kept his gun holstered. Tanner, he said, voice steady. Holster yours. Tanner hesitated. Then, slowly, he obeyed. Reynolds stepped forward, hands up. Hey, he called. What's going on here? The man with the gun turned, eyes wild. He stole from me. Reynolds nodded slowly. Okay, let's talk about it. The man's hand tightened on the gun. Ain't nothing to talk about. Yes, there is, Reynolds said. You pull that trigger? Your life changes forever. The man's breathing was heavy, ragged. Reynolds kept his voice calm. You don't want to do this. The man's hands shook. Tanner took a slow step forward. And then, the gun lowered. The man exhaled shakily, his grip loosening. And just like that, it was over. Back at the station, the captain stared at them. You did what? Reynolds swallowed. We de-escalated. The captain scoffed. And you didn't draw your weapons? No. The captain ran a hand down his face. You could have been shot. Or we could have shot someone who didn't deserve it, Tanner said quietly. The captain exhaled. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. Good work. Reynolds and Tanner exchanged a glance. It wasn't a big moment, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough. James Holloway sat on his porch, rocking gently in his chair when he heard the car pull up. Anthony stepped out, his face unreadable. Dad, he said. James raised an eyebrow. Son. Anthony sat down beside him. You heard about what happened? James smirked. Of course. Anthony sighed. They did good. James chuckled. Told you so. Anthony shook his head. Don't gloat. James just smiled. Then, after a long pause, Anthony said, maybe they really are changing. James nodded. They are. Anthony sighed again, rubbing his face. You were right. James chuckled. I know. Anthony shook his head with a smirk. And for the first time in months, things felt different. Lighter. Better. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Something better. Something right. Reynolds sat in his patrol car, staring out at the city streets. A month ago, he would have seen nothing but crime waiting to happen. Now he saw people. It had been nearly 4 months since Judge Holloway had sentenced them to this community service. 4 months of listening, learning, and unlearning. 4 months of understanding how much they had gotten wrong. Tonight was their last shift at the community center before moving on to their next assignment. And for the first time, Reynolds wasn't sure if he wanted to leave. Tanner exhaled beside him. You thinking what I'm thinking? He asked. Reynolds nodded. Yeah, he admitted. This feels different now. Tanner chuckled. Yeah, it does. They stepped out of the car and walked toward the community center, not as cops, but as something else. Something better. Inside, James Holloway watched them arrive. Ms. Harris was leading a discussion on leadership, her voice steady and confident. The teenagers listened, some more attentively than others. But what caught James' attention was Malik. The young man had been watching Reynolds for weeks now, testing him, waiting to see if he was for real. And tonight, Malik stood. I got a question, he said, crossing his arms. Ms. Harris raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Malik turned to Reynolds. You ever think about quitting? The room went silent. Reynolds exhaled, crossing his arms. Yeah. Malik's eyebrows lifted slightly. I've thought about it a lot, Reynolds admitted. Because for the first time, I see how much damage I've done. How much I've messed up. The silence deepened. Malik nodded slowly. So why don't you? Reynolds thought about that. Then, after a long pause, he said, because if I leave, nothing changes. If I stay, maybe I can fix things. Malik studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he smirked. All right then, he said. Let's see if you do. And just like that, something shifted. Not trust. Not yet. But possibility. And sometimes, that was enough. That night, James and Anthony sat on the porch, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Anthony exhaled. They're really changing. James nodded. I told you. Anthony smirked. Yeah, I know. James sipped his tea. But the real test isn't how much they change now. It's whether they stay changed when no one's watching. Anthony leaned back. Guess we'll find out. James smiled. Yes, they would. The city had begun to shift in subtle ways. It wasn't a grand revolution. There were no headlines screaming about a miraculous change in policing. But something was different. The people in the community felt it. The officers who had once been feared were now watched. Not trusted. Not yet. But watched. Because change, real change, wasn't in words. It was in action. And tonight, that action was about to be tested. Reynolds and Tanner were on patrol, something that used to feel routine. But nothing about this job felt routine anymore. The radio crackled. Disturbance reported on 5th and Elm. Possible domestic dispute. Tanner glanced at Reynolds. That's the Holloway neighborhood. Reynolds nodded. Let's go. They pulled up to a small house, the front doors slightly open. Shouting could be heard from inside. Reynolds felt the old instincts kick in, the urge to call for backup, the urge to enter with force, the urge to control the situation. But those instincts, they were wrong. He had learned that now. Instead, he knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Hello," he called, keeping his voice calm. The shouting stopped. After a long pause, a woman appeared in the doorway. She was breathing hard, her eyes wary. Behind her, a man stood, his fists clenched. Tanner exhaled. This could go wrong fast. "Ma'am," Reynolds said gently. "Are you okay?" The woman hesitated. The man behind her stiffened. She started, then stopped. Reynolds didn't push. "I just want to make sure everyone's safe," he said carefully. "Can we talk?" The woman glanced at the man. Then, slowly, she nodded. Tanner followed Reynolds inside, both of them keeping their hands visible, their movements calm. No shouting, no orders, just listening, just understanding. And in that moment, something incredible happened. The man, who had been so tense, so ready to fight, deflated. He sank onto the couch, covering his face with his hands. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted, his voice shaking. The woman sat beside him, placing a hesitant hand on his back. Reynolds knelt. "Then let's figure it out," he said. And just like that, a situation that could have ended in violence, ended in healing. At the station, the captain listened as Reynolds and Tanner recounted the night's events. "You did what?" he asked, blinking. Reynolds nodded. "We de-escalated." The captain shook his head in disbelief. "No arrests." Tanner shook his head. "Didn't need one." The captain exhaled. Then, after a long pause, he muttered, "Damn." Reynolds smirked. "Yeah." The captain leaned back. "Keep doing that." Reynolds nodded. They would. James Holloway heard about the incident the next day. He met Reynolds and Tanner at the community center, watching them with that same knowing gaze. "Well?" James asked, crossing his arms. Reynolds chuckled. "We did all right." James smiled. And for the first time, Reynolds smiled back. Because maybe, just maybe, they weren't just learning. They were changing. For good. The sun had barely set when James Holloway stepped outside his house, the warm evening air brushing against his skin. It had been nearly 6 months since his wrongful arrest. 6 months since his son, Judge Anthony Holloway, had handed down a sentence unlike any other. And tonight? Tonight would be the night that decided everything. Reynolds and Tanner sat in their patrol car, staring at the glowing red numbers on the dashboard clock. 6:58 p.m. 2 more minutes. Then it would be over. 6 months of community service. 6 months of facing their own biases, their own mistakes. 6 months of learning. "Feels weird," Tanner admitted. Reynolds nodded. "Yeah." Neither of them had expected to change. They had started this assignment resenting it, treating it like a punishment. But now, they weren't sure what they would do when it was over. Ms. Harris clapped her hands, calling the group to attention inside the community center. "All right, everybody," she said. "Tonight, we close a chapter." The teenagers, the volunteers, and members of the community turned their eyes toward the 2 men sitting at the front. 2 officers. 2 changed officers. 6 months ago, Ms. Harris continued, we were given 2 men who didn't understand us, who didn't see us. Reynolds swallowed hard. Tanner looked at the floor. "But now," Miss Harris smiled. "I think they do." The room erupted into murmurs. Then Malik, the teenager who had challenged them from the beginning, stood up. "I got a question," he said. Reynolds exhaled. "Go ahead." Malik crossed his arms. "What happens now?" The question hung in the air. Reynolds and Tanner exchanged a glance. Then Reynolds stood. "Now," he said. He scanned the room. The people he had come to know, the faces he had once feared but now respected. He looked at James Holloway, the man who had started it all. Then he looked back at Malik. "Now," Reynolds said, voice steady, "we keep going." The room fell silent. Malik raised an eyebrow. "You mean?" "We're not stopping," Tanner said, standing beside Reynolds. "We're staying on." A murmur ran through the crowd. Ms. Harris blinked. "Wait, you mean you want to keep working with us?" Reynolds nodded. "If you'll have us." For the first time since this started, James Holloway smiled wide. And for the first time in a long time, the community clapped for the police. Anthony Holloway was waiting outside when his father stepped out of the community center, a smirk playing at his lips. "Well?" Anthony asked. James chuckled. "I think you know." Anthony nodded, exhaling. "Never thought I'd see the day." James patted his son's shoulder. "It's not about what we thought would happen." He gestured back toward the center, where Reynolds and Tanner stood, surrounded by the very people who once distrusted them. It's about what they decided to do. Anthony shook his head with a small smile. Guess I owe you one, Dad. James grinned. You owe me plenty. That night, Reynolds sat in his car, staring at his badge. For years, it had meant power, authority. But tonight, it meant responsibility. And for the first time, he understood exactly what that meant. The streets were quiet, the city settling into the rhythm of the night. James Holloway sat on his porch, rocking slowly in his chair. For months, he had watched the world around him shift in ways he never expected. He had seen the worst in people, but he had also seen the best. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Reynolds parked his patrol car outside the Holloway residence. 6 months ago, he never would have imagined stopping here voluntarily. Yet here he was. Tanner sighed beside him. You sure about this? Reynolds nodded. Yeah. They stepped out of the car, walking toward the porch where James was waiting. James eyed them with quiet amusement. Did I call 911 and forget about it? Reynolds chuckled. No, sir. James gestured to the empty chairs beside him. Then sit. The officers hesitated. Then they obeyed. For a moment, the three men simply sat, the night air wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Then, Reynolds spoke. I don't know how to say this, so I'll just say it. He took a breath. Thank you. James raised an eyebrow. For what? For not letting us stay the same. James nodded slowly. Tanner exhaled. This whole thing started because we treated you like you didn't matter. He shook his head. But you do. Everyone does. James smiled. That's the lesson, isn't it? Reynolds nodded. Yeah. Silence. Then James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You boys did good, he said. But the real work starts now. Reynolds frowned. What do you mean? James tilted his head. It's easy to do the right thing when everyone's watching. The question is, will you keep doing it when no one is? Tanner swallowed. Reynolds exhaled. Then he smiled. Yes, sir, he said. We will. James studied them for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Good. Across town, Judge Anthony Holloway sat at his desk, flipping through legal documents. The case files, the rulings, the endless paperwork, it all felt different now. Because this wasn't just about laws. It was about people. His father had always believed that change came from the heart. Anthony had believed it came from the system. Maybe, just maybe, it came from both. The night stretched on, the city humming with life. James Holloway rocked in his chair, watching the sky. And as Reynolds and Tanner sat beside him, their badges feeling heavier than before. Not with power, but with purpose. James smiled to himself. Because for the first time in his life, he believed they finally understood.